die sogenannten Reparationen, die bezahlt worden sind und heute noch bezahlt werden, das sind ja immense Summen, es geht in den Milliarden,
Ja.
an sogenannte jüdische Vereinigungen und auch an den Staat Israel, erleichtern das offizielle Schuldgewissen der Deutschen. Auf der einen Seite. Auf der anderen Seite, und das ist die Krux dabei, ist auch dieser gewisse Widerspruch. Auf der anderen Seite erkennen allerdings auch viele Deutsche, dass mit diesem Geld ein Staat aufgebaut und aufgerüstet worden ist, der jetzt wiederum ein anderes Volk unterdrückt. Also wir haben im Grunde zwei Dinge. Wir haben eine politische Bewegung, die in ihrer Staatsgewordenheit, in dem Ziel, das sie realisiert hat, nämlich mit der Gründung eines sogenannten jüdischen Staates, haben jene es erreicht, eine Unmenge Geld aufgrund jüdischer Opfer aus Deutschland herauszunehmen, von Deutschland zu erhalten, zu bekommen. Dieses Geld ist in seinem größten Anteil nie an jüdische Opfer oder Opferfamilien geflossen gegangen, sondern hat dieses Geld als sogenannter selbsternannter, kollektiver Vertreter des gesamten jüdischen Volkes für sich benutzt und missbraucht. Das heißt, der Staat, die politische Bewegung und dieser Staat, der daraus entstanden ist, hat alle Reparationszahlungen, die wesentlichen jedenfalls, die ersten, die liefen 1953, 54, ich weiß nicht mehr ganz genau, die Ben-Gurion mit Adenauer ausgehandelt hatte schon, wo gefalscht worden ist um die Höhe und interessanterweise ein ehemaliger NS-Scherge, Staatssekretär Klopke, war einer der Verhandlungsführer mit den Israelis, ja. Und der Vertraute von Adenauer zu jener Zeit. Und da beginnt schon der Missbrauch nicht nur der jüdischen Religion, sondern der Missbrauch des jüdischen Volkes im Ganzen. Und
der jüdischen Opfer.
Und davon rede ich, vor allem von den jüdischen Opfern. Weil man auf ihrem Rücken erstens einmal einen Staat aufgebaut hat und zweitens auch noch das Geld benutzt hat, das ihnen, wenn man so will, also man kann Tod nicht mit Geld entschädigen, aber das ist die einzigste Möglichkeit heutzutage, die man hat, um eine Entschädigung zu machen. Aber man hat dieses Geld dann auch noch benutzt, im Namen dieser Opfer dann andere Opfer zu kreieren. Das heißt, das ist eine doppelte Belastung, unter dem eigentlich Deutschland zu leiden hat. Nur das erkennt die deutsche Politik nicht. Die deutsche Politik erkennt, jedenfalls offiziell nicht, dass erstens einmal die sich selbst nach dem Krieg hineingesprungen sind in dieses Vakuum aufgrund dessen, dass es ja keine jüdischen Vertretungen mehr gab, die waren ja alle verschwunden, ausgerottet, vertilgt oder vertrieben, dass da schon der erste Missbrauch anfängt. Der zweite Missbrauch anfängt damit, dass die Zionisten behauptet haben, sie wären die Repräsentanten des jüdischen Volkes, was sie bis heute ja tun. Und der dritte Missbrauch der Gipfelpunkt dieser ganzen Sache ist dass dieses Geld dann noch, diese Reparationszahlung oder auch die ersten Waffenkäufe, die es gab, die ersten Waffen, die zur Haganah, zur Palmach geflossen sind, kamen aus Deutschland, es waren deutsche Waffen. Ja, also auch unter deutscher Beteiligung hat man nicht nur das deutsche Volk
betrogen.
Im Grunde stark dezimiert. Nicht nur unter deutscher Beteiligung hat der Holocaust stattgefunden, sondern unter deutscher Beteiligung hat man das jüdische Volk auch noch betrogen. Unter deutscher Beteiligung hat man den Zionismus aufgebaut, hat den Staat und den zionistischen Staat unter deutscher Beteiligung aufgebaut und unter deutscher Beteiligung unterdrückt man das palästinensische Volk. Das ist ein Irrsinn. Es ist eine Zunahme, wenn man so will, wenn man es also unter der Logik der Schuld betrachtet, dann ist es eine Zunahme von Schuld und nicht keine Abnahme.
Das ist keine Schuldtilgung.
Eben, das ist eine Schuldvermehrung. Nur interessanterweise spielt in der deutschen Politik, in der deutschen Öffentlichkeit, in der veröffentlichten Meinung, spielt das Schicksal der Palästinenser nicht nicht die gleiche Rolle wie das Schicksal des jüdischen Volkes. Nicht, dass ich das jetzt unbedingt vergleichen wollte, das eine wäre wie das andere gewesen. Wir haben Geschichte muss man immer vergleichen, sonst kann man nicht historisch denken. Aber wie kann sich eine Bundeskanzlerin, oder es spielt keine Rolle, ob Merkel oder Schröder wenn es Unterschiede gab, waren es nur in Nuancen. Helmut Schmidt war noch der Einzige, ich glaube, es war der einzige Bundeskanzler der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, der nicht einmal im Staat Israel besucht hat. Alle anderen waren dort. Er war noch der Einzige, der eine gewisse andere Einstellung hatte, aber es ist so ähnlich in Deutschland, so ähnlich wie in Amerika. Selbst wenn ein Politiker eine andere Einstellung hätte, er kann sie auf lange Sicht nicht durchhalten und nicht realisieren und nicht umsetzen. Das ist das Problem, weil es wird bei allem, es geht ja selbst uns, wie wir hier an diesem Tisch sitzen, so, dass wir in der zionistisch veröffentlichten Meinung werden wir als Juden, als fromme Juden hingestellt, als wären wir Antisemiten. Yeah. Wir wären selbsthassende Juden. Man muss sich das einmal vorstellen. Wir sind selbsthassende Juden. Wir, die die jüdische Religion leben, Tag für Tag, unsere Kinder auf jüdische Schulen schicken, unseren Kindern eine jüdische Erziehung ermöglichen. Wir sollen selbsthassende Juden sein, wohingegen die mit dem Judentum im Grunde, mit den Grundlagen der jüdischen Werte nichts zu tun haben. Diejenigen behaupten, sie würden das Judentum repräsentieren. Das ist eine Chutzpe noch dazu, eine Frechheit noch obendrein. Es ist so eine Umkehrung der Wahrheit, die wir heute erleben. Und das natürlich, da gebe ich Ihnen durchaus recht, speziell hier in Deutschland.
Ihre Familie ist im 19. Jahrhundert aus Russland gekommen, überzeugte Zionisten. Die ersten kamen nach Israel oder Palästina, wie es damals hieß, um dem Antisemitismus zu entkommen.
אנחנו ציונים נלהבים. אנחנו לא נחליף את המדינה ולא נחליף את העם בשום פנים ואופן. לכן כשמדברים על דברים כאלה זה פוגע, זה מרגיז.
איזה דברים?
על יהודים, על אנטישמים, על הדברים כאלה.
אבל הם אומרים שיש שם הרבה אנטישמים.
איפה שמה? אז למה הם לא באים אם יש אנטישמים? אם יש אנטישמים, למה הם לא באים? עד שירגו אותם. מה?
אז למה באמת הם לא באים?
למה הם לא באים? הם אוהבים כסף, יהודי אוהב כסף. יהודי זה רמאי. יהודי זה רמאי. והוא עושה שם כסף, למה לא לבוא פה ולעבוד, אם הוא יכול לעשות שם כסף בלי לעבוד? למה לא?
שם הם לא עובדים?
הם לא עובדים, זה שאני אומרת. שם יש להם כסף בלי לעבוד, פה אם יעבדו, יצטרכו לעבוד.
איך יש להם כסף בלי לעבוד? איך יש להם כסף בלי לעבוד?
איך עשו כסף? ריבית, מלווה בריבית, ובתי מרזח פה, ויין פה, וזה שם. זה הם יודעים, יהודי יודע את הפוילשטיק האלה. יהודי יודע את הפוילשטיק האלה. אני אומרת לך, אני היהודי האמיתית. לא כסף מסנוור אותי, שום דבר לא.
אבל את מדברת כמו האנטישמים שאומרים על היהודים שהם לא עובדים והם עושים...
לא, אני לא מדברת. אני אומרת, הם רוצים להיות שם שיפסם להם, עד שאולי יבוא מישהו, היטלר אחר ויהרוג אותם, יברחו. מה?
The speaker is Mr. Benjamin Friedman, noted authority on Zionism and all of its schemes. Mr. Friedman is a former Jew, and I mean a former Jew. He has fought the communist world conspiracy tooth and nail and stands today as a leading American patriot. We now take you to the speaker's platform to present Benjamin Friedman.
The Zionists and their co-religionists rule this United States as though they were the absolute monarchs of this country. Now you say, well, that's a very broad statement to make, but let me show what happened while you were, I don't want to wear that out. Let me show you what happened while we were all asleep. I'm including myself with you. We were all asleep. What happened? World War I broke out in the summer of 1914. 1914 was the year in which World War I broke out. There are a few people here my age who remember that. Now that war was waged on one side by Great Britain, France, and Russia, and on the other side by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. What happened? Within 2 years, Germany had won that war. Not alone won it nominally, but won it actually. The German submarines, which were a surprise to the world, had swept all the convoys from the Atlantic Ocean, and Great Britain stood there without ammunition for her soldiers, stood there with 1 week's food supply facing her, and after that, starvation. At that time, the French army had mutinied. They lost 600,000 of the flower of the French youth in the defense of Verdun on the Somme. The Russian army was defecting. They were picking up their toys and going home. They didn't want to play war anymore. They didn't like the Tsar. And the Italian army had collapsed. Now, Germany, not a shot had been fired on the German soil. Not an enemy soldier had crossed the border into Germany. And yet, here was Germany offering England peace terms. They offered England a negotiated peace on what the lawyers call a status quo ante basis. That means, let's call the war off and let everything be as it was before the war started. Well, England in the summer of 1916 was considering that. Seriously. They had no choice. They was either accepting this negotiated peace that Germany was magnanimously offering them, or going on with the war and being totally defeated. While that was going on, the Zionists in Germany, who represented the Zionists from Eastern Europe, went to the British War Cabinet, and I'm going to be brief because this is a long story, but I have all the documents to prove any statement that I make if anyone here is curious or doesn't believe what I am possible. The Zionists in London went to the British War Cabinet and they said, look here, you can yet win this war. You don't have to give up. You don't have to accept a negotiated peace offered to you now by Germany. You can win this war if the United States will come in as your ally. The United States was not in the war at that time. We were fresh, we were young, we were rich, we were powerful. And they told England, we will guarantee to bring the United States into the war as your ally, to fight with you on your side, if you will promise us Palestine after you win the war. In other words, they made this deal. We will get the United States into this war as your ally. The price you must pay us is Palestine after you have won the war and defeated Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. Now, England had as much right to promise Palestine to anybody as the United States would have to promise Japan to Ireland for any reason whatsoever. It's absolutely absurd that Great Britain, that never had any connection or any interest or any right in what is known as Palestine, should offer it as coin of the realm to pay the Zionists for bringing the United States into the war. However, they made that promise in October of 1916. October 1916. And shortly after that, I don't know how many here remember it, the United States, which was almost totally pro-German, because the newspapers here were controlled by Jews, the bankers were Jews, all the media of mass communications in this country were controlled by Jews, and they were pro-German, because their people, in a majority of cases, came from Germany, and they wanted to see Germany lick the Tsar. The Jews didn't like the Tsar, and they didn't want Russia to win this war. So the German bankers, the German Jews, Kuhn Loeb, and the other big banking firms in the United States refused to finance France or England to the extent of $1. They stood aside and they said, as long as France and England are tied up with Russia, not 1 cent. But they poured money into Germany. They fought with Germany against Russia, trying to lick the Tsarist regime. Now, those same Jews, when they saw the possibility of getting Palestine, they went to England and they made this deal. At that time, everything changed, like the traffic light that changes from red to green, where the newspapers had been all pro-German, where they'd been telling the people the difficulties that Germany was having fighting Great Britain commercially and in other respects. All of a sudden, the Germans were no good. They were villains. They were Huns. They were shooting Red Cross nurses. They were cutting off babies' hands, and they were no good. Well, shortly after that, Mr. Wilson declared war on Germany. The Zionists in London sent these cables to the United States to Justice Brandeis, go to work on President Wilson. We're getting from England what we want. Now you go to work, and you go to work on President Wilson and get the United States into the war. And that did happen. That's how the United States got into the war. We had no more interest in it. We had no more right to be in it than we have to be on the moon tonight instead of in this room. Now the war, World War I, in which the United States participated, had absolutely no reason to be our war. We went in there, we were railroaded into it. If I can be vulgar, we were suckered into that war merely so that the Zionists of the world could obtain Palestine. Now, that is something that the people in the United States have never been told. They never knew why we went into World War I. Now what happened? After we got into the war, the Zionists went to Great Britain and they said, well, we performed our part of the agreement. Let's have something in writing that shows that you are going to keep your bargain and give us Palestine after you win the war. Because they didn't know whether the war would last another year or another 10 years. So they started to work out a receipt. The receipt took the form of a letter, and it was worded in very cryptic language so that the world at large wouldn't know what it was all about. And that was called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was merely Great Britain's promise to pay the Zionists what they had agreed upon as a consideration for getting the United States into the war. So this great Balfour Declaration that you hear so much about is just as phony as a $3 bill, and I don't think I can make it more emphatic than that. Now, that is where all the trouble started. The United States was in the war, The United States crushed Germany. We went in there, and it's history, you know what happened. Now, when the war was ended, and the Germans went to Paris, to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, there were 117 Jews there as a delegation representing the Jews, headed by Bernard Baruch. I was there, I ought to know. Now what happened? The Jews at that peace conference, when they were cutting up Germany and parceling out Europe to all these nations that claimed a right to a certain part of European territory, the Jews said, how about Palestine for us? And they produced, for the first time, to the knowledge of Germans, this Balfour Declaration. So the Germans, for the first time, realized, oh, that was the game. That's why the United States came into the war. And the Germans, for the first time, realized that they were defeated. They suffered this terrific reparations that was slapped onto them because the Zionists wanted Palestine. And they were determined to get it at any cost. Now that brings us up to another very interesting point. When the Germans realized this, they naturally resented it. Up to that time, the Jews had never been better off in any country in the world than they had been in Germany. You had Mr. Rathenau there, who was maybe 100 times as important in industry and finance as Bernard Baruch in this country. You had Mr. Ballin, who owned the two big steamship lines, the North German Lloyd and the Hamburg American line, thank you. You had Mr. Bleichroeder, who was the banker for the Hohenzollern family. You had the Warburgs in Hamburg, who were the big merchant bankers, the biggest in the world. The Jews were doing very well in Germany. No question about that. Now, the Germans felt, well, that was quite a sellout. It was a sellout that I can best compare. Suppose the United States was at war today with the Soviet Union. And we were winning. And we told the Soviet Union, well, let's quit. We offer you peace terms. Let's forget the whole thing. And all of a sudden, Red China came into the war as an ally of the Soviet Union. And throwing them into the war brought about our defeat. A crushing defeat, with a reparations the likes of which man's imagination cannot encompass. Imagine, then, if we found out that it was the Chinese in this country, our Chinese citizens, who all the time we thought they were loyal citizens working with us, were selling us out to the Soviet Union, and it was through them that Red China was brought into the war against us. How would we feel in the United States against Chinese? I don't think one of them would dare show its face on any street. There wouldn't be lampposts enough convenient to take care of them. Imagine how we would feel. Well, that's how the Germans felt towards these Jews. We've been so nice to them, and from 1905 on, when the first communist revolution in Russia failed, and the Jews had to scramble out of Russia, they all went to Germany. And Germany gave them refuge, and they were treated very nicely. And here, they sold Germany down the river for no reason at all, other than they wanted Palestine as a so-called Jewish commonwealth. Now, Nahum, Sokolow, all the great leaders, the big names that you read about in connection with Zionism today, they, in 1919, 1920, 21, 22, and 23, they wrote in all their papers, and the press was filled with their statements, that the feeling against the Jews in Germany is due to the fact that they realized that this great defeat was brought about by our intercession and bringing the United States into the war against them. The Jews themselves admitted that. It wasn't that the Germans in 1919 discovered that a glass of Jewish blood tasted better than Coca-Cola or Münchner beer. There was no religious feeling. There was no sentiment against those people merely on account of their religious beliefs. It was all political. It was economic. It was anything but religious. Nobody cared in Germany whether a Jew went home and pulled down the shade and said Shema Yisrael or Our Father. No one cared in Germany any more than they do in the United States. Now this feeling that developed later in Germany was due to one thing, that the Germans held the Jews responsible for their crushing defeat for no reason at all, because World War I was started against Germany for no reason for which they were responsible. They were guilty of nothing, only of being successful. They built up a big navy, they built up world trade. You must remember, Germany, at the time of Napoleon, at the time of the French Revolution, what was the German Reich consisted of 300 small city-states, principalities, dukedoms, and so forth. 300 little separate political entities. And between that time, between the period between Napoleon and Bismarck, they were consolidated into one state. And within 50 years after that time, they became one of the world's great powers. Their navy was rivaling Great Britain. They were doing business all over the world. They could undersell anybody and make better products. And what happened? What happened as a result of that? There was a conspiracy between England, France, and Russia that we must slap down Germany. Because there isn't one historian in the world that can find a valid reason why those three countries decided to wipe Germany off the map politically. Now what happened after that? When Germany realized that the Jews were responsible for her defeat, they naturally resented it. But not a hair on the head of any Jew was harmed. Not a single hair. Professor Chancel of Georgetown University, who had access to all the secret papers of the State Department, wrote in his book and quoted from a State Department document written by Hugo Schoenfeld, a Jew who Cordell Hull sent to Europe in 1933 to investigate the so-called camps of political prisoners. And he wrote back that he found them in very fine condition. They were in excellent shape. Everybody treated well. And they were filled with communists. Well, a lot of them were Jews, because the Jews happened to be maybe 98% of the communists in Europe at that time. And there were some priests there, and ministers, labor leaders, masons, and others who had international affiliation. Now, the Jews sort of tried to keep the lid on this fact. They didn't want the world to really understand that they had sold out Germany and that the Germans resented that. So they did take appropriate action against them. They, shall I say, discriminated against them wherever they could. They shunned them, the same as we would the Chinese or the Negroes or the Catholics or anyone in this country that sold us out to an enemy and brought about our defeat. Now, after a while, the Jews of the world didn't know what to do, so they called a meeting in Amsterdam. Jews from every country in the world attended in July 1933. And they said to Germany, you fire Hitler and you put every Jew back into his former position, whether he was a communist, no matter what he was. you can't treat us that way. And we, the Jews of the world, are calling upon you and serving this ultimatum upon you. Well, the Germans told them, you can imagine. So what did they do? They broke up. And Samuel Untermeyer, if the name means anything to people here, you want to ask the question? Well, I don't want to go by what they were called. We're now using English words, and what they were called in Germany is not very material, but they were communists because in 1917, the communists took over Germany for a few days. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and a group of Jews in Germany took over the government for 3 days. In fact, when the Kaiser ended the war, he fled to Holland because he thought the communists were going to take over Germany as they did Russia, and that he was going to meet the same fate that the Tsar did in Russia. So he left and went to Holland for safety, for security. Now, at that time, when the communist threat in Germany was quashed, it was quiet, the Jews were working still, trying to get back into their former status, and the Germans fought them in every way they could without hurting a hair on anyone's head. The same as one group, the prohibitionists, fought the people who were interested in liquor, and they didn't fight one another with pistols. They did it every way they could. Well, that's the way they were fighting the Jews in Germany. And at that time, mind you, there were 80 to 90 million Germans, and there were only 460,000 Jews. Less than 1/2 of 1% of the population of Germany were Jews. And yet, they controlled all the press, they controlled most of the economy, because they had come in and with cheap money, you know the way the mark was devalued, they bought up practically everything. Well, in 1933, when Germany refused to surrender, mind you, to the World Conference of Jews in Amsterdam, they broke up, and Mr. Untermeyer came back to the United States, who was the head of the American delegation and the president of the whole conference, and he went from the steamer to ABC and made a radio broadcast throughout the United States in which he said, the Jews of the world now declare a holy war against Germany. We are now engaged in a sacred conflict against the Germans, and we are going to starve them into surrender. We are going to use a worldwide boycott against them that will destroy them because they are dependent upon their export business. And it is a fact that 2/3 of Germany's food supply had to be imported. And it could only be imported with the proceeds of what they exported, their labor. So if Germany could not export, 2/3 of Germany's population would have to starve. There just was not enough food for more than 1/3 of a population. Now, in this declaration, which I have here, it was printed and a whole page, in the New York Times on August 7th, 1933, Mr. Samuel Untermeyer boldly stated that this economic boycott is our means of self-defense. President Roosevelt has advocated its use in the NRA, which some of you may remember, where everybody was to be boycotted unless they followed the rules laid down by the New Deal, which of course was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at that time. Nevertheless, the Jews of the world declared a boycott against Germany, and it was so effective that you couldn't find one thing in any store anywhere in the world with the words "Made in Germany" on it. In fact, an executive of the Woolworth Company told me that they had to dump millions of dollars worth of crockery and dishes into the river, that their stores were boycotted. If anyone came in and found a dish marked made in Germany, they were ticketed with signs, Hitler, murderer, and so forth, and like something like these sit-ins that are taking place in the South. R.H. Macy, which is controlled by a family called Strauss, who also happen to be Jews, a woman found stockings there, which came from Chemnitz, marked made in Germany. Well, they were cotton stockings. They may have been there 20 years, because since I've been observing women's legs in the last 20 years, I haven't seen a pair with cotton stockings on them. So Macy, I saw Macy boycotted with hundreds of people walking around with signs, murderers, Hitlerites, and so forth. Now, up to that time, not one hair of any Jew had been hurt in Germany. There was no suffering, there was no starvation, there was no murder, there was nothing. Now, that, naturally, the Germans said, why, who are these people to declare a boycott against us and throw all our people out of work and our industries come to a standstill? Who are they to do that to us? And they naturally resented it. Certainly they painted swastikas on stores owned by Jews. Why should a German go in and give their money to a storekeeper who is part of a boycott, who is going to starve Germany into surrender into the Jews of the world, who are going to dictate who their premier or chancellor was to be? Well, it was ridiculous. That continued for some time. And it wasn't until 1938 when a young Jew from Poland walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot one of the officials that the Germans really started to get rough with the Jews in Germany. And you found them then breaking windows and having street fights and so forth. Now, for anyone to say that, I don't like to use the word anti-Semitism because it's meaningless, but it means something to you still, so I'll have to use it. The only reason that there was any feeling in Germany against Jews was that they were responsible, number one, for World War I, number two, for this worldwide boycott, and number three, did I say for World War I, they were responsible for the boycott, and also for World War II, because after this thing got out of hand, it was absolutely necessary for the Jews and Germany to lock horns in a war to see which one was going to survive. In the meanwhile, I had lived in Germany, and I knew that the Germans had decided Europe is going to be Christian or communist. There is no in-between. It's going to be Christian or it's going to be communist. And the Germans decided, we're going to keep it Christian if possible. And they started to rearm. And their intention was, by that time, the United States had recognized the Soviet Union, which they did in November 1933. The Soviet Union was becoming very powerful, and Germany realized, well, our turn is going to come soon unless we are strong. The same as we in this country are saying today, our turn is going to come soon unless we're strong, and our government is spending $83 or $84 billion of your money for defense, they say. Defense against who? Defense against 40,000 little Jews in Moscow that took over Russia and then, in their devious ways, took over control of many other governments of the world. Now, for this country to now be on the verge of a third world war from which we cannot emerge a victor is something that staggers my imagination.